Good evening. My name is Candace, and I'm an event manager at Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of the rest of the staff at Town Hall and our partners at Elliott Bay Books, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's live stream presentation with data analyst Alberto Cairo. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. Thank you for tuning in tonight. Town Hall is proud to be a community-focused organization, a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, even if it means we can't gather in person. I'd like to thank Alberto for appearing tonight to help make that possible. Town Hall will continue to produce virtual content this season, including our podcast, In the Moment, which features exclusive guests. Many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form on our digital media library. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include a conversation between authors Donna Miscalta and Cecilia Aragon on the struggles of overcoming gender and racial bias for Latina women, a journey with composer John Luther Adams on his experience making music in the frozen woods of Alaska, and a presentation by mathematics professor Jason Rosenhaus considering the role of logic puzzles in recreation, math, and philosophy. Check out more of what's in store on our online calendar at townhallseattle.org. Town Hall and the nonprofit community at large have been put under significant strain due to the ever-changing landscape. We hope that you will consider extending your generosity to help support us during this difficult time by making a donation and becoming a member. Click on the donate button at the bottom of your screen at any time. Our partner booksellers have also been hit by the negative effects of the pandemic and can use your support as well. We encourage you to support local independent bookstores by purchasing a copy of the book being presented tonight. Use the link on this live stream page to purchase through Elliott Bay Books. For viewers who want to watch this broadcast using closed captioning, we recommend viewing the stream via our YouTube page linked here in the chat. To enable real-time closed captioning, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. The video will be available for re-watching immediately following tonight's broadcast. Tonight's presentation will be about an hour, including Q&A. Alberto will select questions from those submitted in the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. We will also take questions from those submitted in the YouTube chat. We can't guarantee that we'll be able to address every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible, so please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and through the support of our sponsors. Our Arno Matulsko Science Series is supported by Microsoft, KUOW, Wyncote Foundation Northwest, and the taxpayers of Washington. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of the members watching tonight. And now for tonight's program. We've all heard that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but what if we don't understand what we're looking at? That is the central question for tonight's lecture. Alberto Cairo is the Knight Chair in Visual Journalism at the School of Communication of the University of Miami. He's also the Director of Visualization Program at UM Center for Computational Science. He has also been Head of Information Graphics at media publications in Spain and Brazil. Professor Cairo is the author of several textbooks, including The Functional Art, an Introduction to Information Graphics and Visualization, published in 2012, and The Truthful Art, Data, Charts, and Maps for Communication, which was published in 2016. He currently consults with companies and institutions like Google and the Congressional Budget Office, and has provided visualization training to the European Union, Eurostat, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Army National Guard, among others. His book, How Charts Lie, Getting Smarter About Visual Information, out now in paperback, is the topic of this evening's talk. Please join me in welcoming Alberto Cairo.
Thank you, Candace. Pleasure to be here, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you also to Town Hall Seattle for organizing the talk. I'm going to begin sharing my screen, so you will see my slides. Let me go here. There we go. So yeah, How Charts Lie. That's the latest book that I have written, which, as Candace was saying, it just came out in paperback a month ago. So How Charts Lie, the title is a little bit of like sort of like a joke, because The book is really not how to lie with charts. It's more about how to tell the truth with charts. And moreover, I also joke with people when I present the book saying that it's really not a book about how to lie in purpose with charts, but it's more about how we lie to ourselves with the charts that we see every day in news media, in social media, in textbooks, and in other places. I believe that it's a fundamental skill to understand how to read maps and graphs and what we call in my world data visualizations, how to read those things correctly. The book is written in a very friendly tone. It's the tone that you're going to hear during the talk. That's exactly the same tone that I use in the book, which is sort of like friendly, easygoing. There are a few F-bombs here and there in the book, and actually some people who read the book appreciated that. One of the latest reviews that the book received online from a mother of several boys said that she bought the book for her boys, but she ended up reading the book herself. And she said that she at first considered charts a fairly boring topic, but then she picked up the book and she had a lot of fun with it and she laughed with it. And then my favorite sentence is that she will never look at charts and graphs the same way again. That's the purpose of the book, to make everyone aware of how important it is to use charts well and how to read them correctly. Now, the reason why I think that this is extremely important is that we are living through a golden age of data visualization, of charts. We see charts everywhere. If you work in business, you see charts and probably design charts every day using software tools such as Excel and many others that we are all familiar with, right? In business analytics, in the sciences, we see charts in the sciences. In the world where I come from, in my professional world, the world of journalism, there has been an explosion in the past few years in the use of data visualizations. If you followed, for example, the recent elections in the United States, you have seen charts everywhere in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the 538. Part of the reason that data visualization has become so popular in news media is that through their analytics, media publications are seeing that we readers, love to see charts, to the point that many of the most popular stories ever published by many media organizations, such as the Washington Post or the New York Times, are charts. The most viewed piece of content ever published by the Washington Post online actually is a data visualization. Some of you probably are familiar with it. It's a simulation of how an outbreak of a virus spreads in a population depending on the different measures that a government may take or not take, right? If we apply, for example, social distancing and masks, etc., the pandemic will not spread as rapidly as it would if we don't apply those measures. Well, that story by the Washington Post, using plenty of charts and graphs and data visualizations, quickly became the most popular story ever published by the Washington Post online. And this is true also of the New York Times. The most popular story by the New York Times ever, the New York Times online, is also a data visualization. The Wall Street Journal, many different places, many different media organizations are using data visualization widely, and in part it is because readers love them and readers demand seeing those data visualizations. And I think that this is great because data visualization, charts, is a great tool for communication. It's also a great tool for thinking, because what data visualizations do is to transform numbers into objects, into graphs, into maps, into charts that may let us see the truths that hide behind those numbers, may let us see the patterns and the trends that hide behind large amounts of numbers. And I think that gives us superpowers. It let us see a good chart, let us see through the complexity of the data. And this is one of the points that I make in How Charts Lie, that certainly charts have a dark side, so to speak, but the good side of them is that they can be great thinking tools. So yes, we are living through a golden age of data visualization, but the whole reason why I wrote the book is that I throughout the years, I have also observed the many ways in which charts can be either misused or they can be misunderstood. And we are seeing cases every single day of charts being either misused or misunderstood. Just today, just this morning, the President of the United States, that as you know, is contesting the results of the recent presidential elections, was tweeting out graphs. Take a look at Wisconsin, right? This graph over here is showing the voting count process during November the 3rd and November the 4th. Red corresponds to Republican votes and blue corresponds to Democratic votes for a candidate, Joe Biden, for the president-elect Joe Biden. And Trump was arguing through this graph that there was something weird over here because there's a huge increase in the number of votes for Biden, right? And he did the same thing with Michigan, because something happened also over here. Now, Trump is obviously using these charts to argue for something that it doesn't really exist. There has been no case of voter fraud. He's seeing a pattern in a graph, right? He finds that pattern weird, that there is such a huge increase, and he's projecting what he wants to believe and what he wants to argue in an otherwise perfectly fine graph. The graph is true. It's showing us the process of counting the vote, and there's nothing strange. There's nothing mysterious. Probably this huge increase in the count in favor of President-elect Biden is simply because an effect of how votes are counted, because we have votes probably that were people who voted in person versus people who voted through mail. And those votes that came through mail probably are counted just at once, and then they are all reported at the same time. And that's the reason why you see such a sudden spike. When I saw these tweets this morning, by the way, I replied to President Trump saying that something that is true, right? It says, sir, back in 2019, when How Chats Lie was released, the hardcover of the book was released, I sent you a signed copy of the book, in part to thank you for helping me promote the book, because every time that Trump tweets out a bad chart or a misunderstood chart, sales of the book increase, maybe for good reason. But I hope that one day he will read the book and learn something useful out of it. I think that it will be incredibly important. Now, why it's so important to learn how to read charts correctly and how to avoid being misled by the charts that we see every day? Well, in part it is because we have evidence showing that we human beings, we readers, even if we don't understand a chart really well, the mere presence of a chart or a graph or a map or a bunch of numbers in a message, for example, a news story or an advertisement or whatever, the mere presence of those numbers or the visual representation of those numbers, namely charts, the mere presence of those objects in that message makes that message more credible. It makes that message more persuadable. And the reason why that happens, some researchers speculate, is that we tend to automatically equate the presence of numbers and the presence of charts to science, to accuracy, to truth with an uppercase T. And we need to be extremely careful with that. At the same time that I say that charts are extremely useful and we should all learn how to use them and read them correctly, at the same time, we need to train our skeptical brain in order to read them correctly. Now, how to do this, right? And this is what the book is about. So I'm going to give you sort of like a summary of the main points that I make in the book. The first point is that we need to abandon myths and sayings such as a picture is worth 1,000 words, what Candace mentioned at the very beginning when she was introducing the talk. So a picture is worth 1,000 words, yes and no. I usually say this myth is only true, a picture is worth 1,000 words, if we append a second part of the sentence, which will be if we know how to read it. A picture is worth 1,000 words if we know how to read it. If we don't know how to read it, then it would not be worth 1,000 words. It may be worthless, completely worthless. So going back to the President of the United States, when he was elected, the current president of the United States in 2016, this photograph was taken in the White House when he took office. I think that it was in April or May or something like that. A few months after he took office, a reporter who was visiting the White House took a picture in the hallways of the White House. And as you can see, that someone was carrying a framed copy of the map representing the results of the 2016 presidential election, or the past presidential election. And this is the case that opens up how chat slides, the first case that I discussed, because President Trump loves this map, absolutely loves this map. And actually, there are also reports from other journalists who came visit President Trump in the Oval Office a few months after he was elected, and Trump had a stack of copies of this map, and he was giving away copies of the map to people who came visit him in the Oval Office, saying, "Hey, take a look at the map, take a look at the map. See how much red it has," right? Implying we won on a landslide because there is so much red on the map and so little blue. And that is true. I mean, that map, if you don't know how to read it well, it unconsciously creates the perception of a Republican victory by a landslide, because it looks like an ocean of red with a few areas of blue here and there, right? If we calculate mathematically the area of the map covered in red, that's around 80% of the map. 80% of the map is covered in red, and only 20% of the map is covered in blue. And indirectly, Trump and some of his supporters were using the map to argue for a landslide victory and a huge popular support. But obviously, that's not a good way to read that map, because that map was not designed to show popular support, number of people who voted for each one of the candidates in 2016. The purpose of that map, and in order to read a map correctly, or a chart or a graph correctly, we need to understand what the purpose of the chart is. The purpose of that map is not to show popular support. The purpose of that map is to show who won where, which counties in the US went Republican and which counties went a Democratic. Part of the reason why the map can also be misleading if we don't know how to read it well, this is critical, because there's nothing wrong with that map. It's only that it's being misread by someone. Another reason why it can be misleading is that huge areas over here in the middle of the country are devoid of population, right? Very few people live in this area here in the country. People tend to concentrate in the middle of the country, tend to concentrate in relatively big metropolitan areas, which is a reality that is revealed if we represent the vote in a completely different way. This is another map that was designed by my friend Ken Field, a famous cartographer. What Ken did was to represent every voter in the 2016 election with a little dot, and then so there are more than 100 million dots in that map. You can even zoom in and see them. And each dot is color-coded according to whether that voter voted Republican or Democratic, and then he geolocated those dots close to where those voters voted. And it reveals the reality that actually popular support was almost half and half, which is what actually happened in the 2016 election. So which kind of chart I would hang on the walls of the White House if I were elected president? I cannot be elected president because I was born in Spain. I can run for Congress and for the Senate. That could be a plan B for the future if this charts thing doesn't work out. But let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, that I could run for president, right? And I want to celebrate my victory. What type of map I will hang on the walls of the White House? Well, I could hang this map, because this map is a more realistic depiction of popular support. Or I could do just a simple bar graph, right? If we do a bar graph of the 2016 election to represent popular support, popular vote, and we could do a bar graph in which, obviously, but the problem is that we will see that President Trump actually received less popular support than candidate Clinton, and Trump won thanks to the electoral vote. Completely legal, but he didn't win the popular vote. The challenge, though, is that if I really wanted to celebrate my victory in a presidential election, I don't think that this bar graph will be enough. And this is another critical lesson that I try to convey in How Chats Lie, which is Charts show as much as they hide. And in order to interpret a chart correctly, sometimes you need to try to go a little bit beyond the chart, if it is possible. How to do this in this particular case? Well, we could consider not only the people who voted, but the adults who could have voted and didn't vote for some reason, didn't vote or couldn't vote. The challenge is that if we do that, right, that is the biggest group of possible voters in the country, because around 40% of possible voters, adults who could have voted in the presidential election in 2016, didn't even vote. This is a reality, by the way, that reappears whenever we have an election in this country, right? Nearly half of people in this country don't bother or don't want or can't, or their vote is suppressed, which is also a reality. Around 40% of people didn't even vote. So if I wanted to show popular support, this will be the graph that I would put on the walls of my White House, because it's a little bit more of a realistic depiction of what really happened with the popular vote in the United States. I will be taking into account the whole universe of possible voters who could have voted for me. The lessons of how charts lie extend to several things that I encourage people to do whenever we see a chart, and that I will encourage you to do whenever you see a chart, again, in news media, in social media, etc. The first thing comes before we even see charts in social media. I do believe that it's greatly beneficial for anyone to get a little bit more of a sense, or a better sense, of what some authors have called numeracy, and also a sense of graphicacy. What is graphicacy and what is numeracy? Well, author Marc Monmonier, who is a cartographer who has written several wonderful books about maps, among them, for instance, How to Lie with Maps, which was one of my inspirations for How Charts Lie. In another one of his books, Mapping It Out, Monmonier says that he thinks that today, in order to be an educated person in a democratic republic, to participate in the political and civic process in the country, we need to be literate, obviously, because we need to be able to read and write, and to sort of like express ideas and understand everybody else's ideas through reading and writing. But he also says that there are other skills, there's other pieces of knowledge that we need to acquire. For instance, articulacy, the ability to express ourselves correctly through spoken words. And then on top of that, numeracy. Now, what is numeracy? Numeracy is not just statistics, and it's not just mathematics. It is more like a sense of numbers, right? And that can be developed, that can be trained. And I'm going to give you a couple of suggestions of how to do this. It's sort of like develop some sort of like a sixth sense, like an alarm in the back of your brain that will start ringing whenever you see a number or a chart that doesn't look right. You say, there's something wrong with this chart, or maybe I am not understanding this chart correctly. Let me look into it. That alarm that rings in the back of your brain, that's numeracy at work. And then in complement or in supplement to numeracy, we also have graphicacy, which is essentially graphical literacy. Numbers can be represented through maps, through charts, through graphs, and we can also try to develop a sense on how to read them correctly. Now, there are wonderful books out there, not only How Charts Lie, but many, many others. This is just an aside, that can help you develop this sense of numeracy. There is the recent, for example, The Art of Statistics, which I highly recommend. Counting by Deborah Stone. This was just published a month ago, if I'm not wrong. And it's a wonderful book discussing the idea of counting things and what that does mean. It sounds so simple, right? Oh, a book about counting, that sounds so boring. But there are so many things that we can learn by learning how to count things better, right? Naked Statistics by Charles Whelan, or How Not to Be Wrong by Jordan Lellenberg. All these books can help anyone, at least they help me, they can help anyone develop this sense of numeracy. Now, after we develop this sense of numeracy and also of graphicacy, complementary to numeracy, what is the next step? Well, the next step is to pay attention. That sounds so basic, right? But it's so hard these days to pay attention. We are all trained not to pay attention. We are surrounded by distractions, social media, TV, radio, podcasts, etc. And we tend not to pay attention to what surrounds us anymore, or at least we tend to do it a little bit less than before. And of course, people, if you want to become a good reader of charts, the first rule to becoming a good reader of charts is to pay attention to charts, because charts are not illustrations. Charts are visual arguments, and in order to understand them correctly, we need to read them, not just look at them, but actually read them. Now, once we train ourselves to, whenever we see a graph or a chart or a map, stop and try to understand what it is, what are the features of that chart that we need to pay attention to? I'm going to just give you a description of a few of them, not all of them, because this is what how charts lie. This is the core of how charts lie. One of the essential one is the sources of that chart. So, for instance, if a chart designed by someone doesn't disclose where the data comes from, if it doesn't have a source line, distrust that chart. Distrust that chart. If it does disclose the source, then the chart may be could be trustworthy, but it can take you a long way, being a reader, to take a look at the primary source, or at least sort of like interrogate the chart to see or to understand whether the chart is representing or showing what it claims to be showing. Sometimes it is extremely easy, if we don't pay attention to a chart, to jump to conclusions too quickly. I'm going to show you just an example, because this happens to everyone, including me, someone who has been working with charts for more than 20 years. A few years ago, one of my students, Luis Melgar, who is now a data journalist in the Wall Street Journal, he was working in his master's a project, right? He was finishing his master's degree, was working on his master's capstone project, and he wanted to do something about a data visualization, a huge chart-driven, data visualization-driven story, exploring the issue of homelessness in Florida, right? Particularly homelessness among students. How many students in Florida are homeless? And he came to my office one day with several graphs and several charts, etc. I have provided here the link to the story. I forgot to mention, by the way, this is just an aside, that at the end of the presentation, I am going to share the slides. So you will be able to click on all those links that you're seeing, etc., and the resources that I'm providing. So don't worry about that. I will send you these slides as a PDF in the chat window. In any case, Luis came to my office. He showed me several graphs. Some of the maps that I saw and some of the charts that he showed me completely shocked me. For instance, these two maps over here show that there are certain counties in Florida in which more than 5,000 students are homeless. And when we take a look at the percentage of students who are homeless, there are certain counties in Florida in which more than 20% of students are homeless. 20%, that's 1 out of 5. So my reaction was like, whoa, I was like surprised. I was shocked. I was like, how is this even possible? This is a humanitarian crisis, 20% of homelessness. And then Luis explained to me, well, perhaps you are jumping to conclusions too quickly, which is, again, something that we do if we don't, all of us do, if we don't pay attention. He said, I didn't explain to you yet, and you have not read yet, what the state of Florida calls a homeless person. To the state of Florida, a homeless person is not someone who lives on the streets, which is probably the image that came to your brain when I said the word homeless. That was my snap reaction. I didn't pay attention. I took a look at the chart. Oh, wow. I jumped to conclusions. If I had stopped myself and paid attention to the story, I would have read the copy that surrounds the maps and the charts in the story that he designed. And I would have discovered that what the state of Florida calls a homeless person is not someone who lives on the streets. It's someone who doesn't have a permanent home. That means that if a student needs to change homes, let's say 3 times a year, maybe that student comes from a poor family who cannot maintain the same home all year round. This student changes home 3 times a year. Or, I don't know, these students' parents are separated or divorced, and this student needs to switch homes several times a year. That student may become part of the data set of student homelessness in Florida. Now, that doesn't render all these charts incorrect, but it is essential as a reader to understand what it is being shown and to read the descriptions of what it is being measured. And it is also critical for the communicators like myself, designers and visual artists, journalists, etc., to disclose these definitions and also to link to the primary sources. Again, if a journalist doesn't link to a primary source, distrust that story. A reader has the right to know where the information came from. Now, sometimes people jump to conclusions also with graphics that we see every day. Another case that I describe in the book is the many misunderstandings of this type of map. Now, this is not a map that you obviously see very often in Seattle, right? But it's a type of map that I can guarantee you that we see every year during hurricane season down here in Miami. This cone, right? This cone that shows the probable path of the center of a hurricane in the next 5 days, right? This is Hurricane Dorian from 2019. Well, the first time that most people see this map, right? When they see this cone, they interpret this map incorrectly. If you don't pay attention and you don't read the fine print provided by the National Hurricane Center, which is the center that produces this map every year, many people, when they see that cone, they envision an area under threat. And some people even envision a hurricane growing in size, right? They interpret this cone as saying, if I am inside the cone, I am in danger. If I am outside of the cone, I am not in danger. So if this particular case, for example, if someone lives in Key West down here and they see this map, they say, well, probably I'm not in danger because I am outside of the cone, right? But this is not how to read this map, obviously. So how to read this map? You will only discover how to read this map if you try to read the documentation that surrounds this map. Because again, the map is perfectly fine. It is only that it's a complex display of a complex phenomenon, and therefore it requires a lot of attention in order to interpret it correctly. So how to read the cone of uncertainty? Just, I don't know, perhaps some of you are planning to retire to Florida when you can retire, right? And you will get to see this map very, very often, I guarantee that. So how to read this map? Well, in order to read this map correctly, I need to explain to you how the map is created. The map is created this way. First of all, the National Hurricane Center, when there's a storm approaching, they gather a lot of forecast models, mathematical models that sort of like show possible paths of the center of a hurricane. And we can envision those different forecast models as line. It could go here, it could go there, it could go there. They vary certain predictions, and depending on what they vary, air pressure, ocean temperature, when you vary those things, you will get a slightly different forecast model, right? Then what the National Hurricane Center does is to sort of like create what they would call their best prediction, what they consider the most likely position of the center, this is important, of the center of the hurricane in the next 5 days. So we could envision that as the dots that appear in the center of the cone. Then what they do is to surround those dots, right, with circles of increasing size. What are those dots? What are those circles? Those circles represent the level of uncertainty of that forecast. This means that, and the circles grow in size because it is much easier to predict what is going to happen tomorrow. That's why the circle is so small, versus what is going to happen 5 days from now. That's the reason why the circle becomes much bigger. And then they draw a line around the circles, and then they erase the circles, and the result is what is called the cone of uncertainty. So how to read the cone of uncertainty correctly? Instead of focusing too much on the center line, we need to imagine that this dot could move to the right, to the left, up, down, etc. It could be anywhere over here, like sort of like a dot appearing or disappearing, right? Each one of those animated dots representing a possible position of the center of the storm in the following 5 days. And we also need to imagine and remember that what the cone represents is only the center of the storm. That means, again, that if I live in Key West, I may still be affected by the storm, because if the storm ends up going over here, a hurricane, is an enormous object. So if it ends up going over here, which is pretty possible, it will still affect me just because I will be in the area affected by the storm. Anyway, if you're interested in reading more a little bit about this, I wrote a piece for the New York Times last year explaining people how to read hurricane maps correctly, just because I was observing tons and tons of people misinterpreting these maps. Maybe not because the maps are incorrectly designed, but maybe because the maps are not correctly explained by journalists. I believe that is a responsibility of the TV journalists who present this type of graphic on TV during every hurricane season, to explain to people how to read these maps, because these maps are complex and they cannot be understood, in the blink of an eye. They require a lot of attention and a lot of understanding. And this is what communicators should provide. As readers, we should also try to identify what the chart is showing, and try to also identify what the chart may have shown or doesn't show, because charts, as I said before, show as much as they hide. That's a feature of chart. A chart can never be a perfect representation of reality. This is related to the old saying, the map is not the territory, because if a map were identical to the territory, it will be the territory itself, right? A chart, a map, a graph is always an abstraction of reality. It's always a simplification of reality. The challenge with simplification, though, is that it can go too far. Sometimes simplifications become oversimplifications. Let me show you an example. This is a chart that shows the murder rate in the United States per 100,000 people. Measure, there we go, from 0 to 11 people per 100,000. As you may have all heard, this story of violent crime and murder rate, it went up during the 70s and the 80s, came down during the 90s, stayed the same in the 2000s. And then in the past 6 years or so, the line has picked up again. It's increasing again. If we extend this line towards the present, the line continues increasing. Now, this chart itself, mathematically speaking and geometrically speaking, there's nothing wrong with it. The challenge is that if we don't try to look a little bit beyond the chart and try to understand what the chart is saying, it is very easy to describe this chart as the United States is becoming a more dangerous country. The United States is becoming more violent. And that is only partially true, because it is not true that most of the United States is more violent than it used to be. If we could go beyond the chart and take a look, for instance, at every single place of the United States, if we could plot on this vertical scale with a little dot every town, every city in the United States, most places in the United States have relatively low murder rates. What is the challenge, though? The challenge is what in statistics is called extreme values or outliers. Outliers are values that are extremely extreme, that is so high, very, very, very high. Well, there are certain places in the United States that in the past few years, certain neighborhoods, in certain towns, in certain cities have become so violent that if we try to plot them on this vertical scale, they will go through the roof. That's the effect of outliers. Another example of an outlier, which is sort of like a joke that I tell you how chats lie, is that imagine that you are with a group of friends in a bar, and you could average the income, all your income. Well, the average income in the United States, I think, is like $33,000 or something like that. That's the average income. But suddenly Bill Gates gets into the bar, and then suddenly everybody becomes a millionaire on average, just because Bill Gates is there. And when you average all the salaries of everybody in the bar, everybody becomes a millionaire or a billionaire even, just because Bill Gates is in the bar, which is very similar. It's a very similar effect. Bill Gates is an outlier in the bar, and he skews that average, right? Well, a rate is not necessarily an average, but it's sort of like a measure that tries to aggregate a lot of data into a single number, that national rate. And sometimes those high level of aggregations may be a little bit confusing or a little bit misleading if they are not well explained. So when I present this example to colleagues of mine, to journalists, I usually say, if you only show people this chart, you are not informing people, you are misinforming them, because most people, most readers are not aware of this fact. If you want to inform people, you can still show the original chart, but then you need to explain this fact. You need to explain that this increase that we are observing in the past few years is likely an effect of these extreme values that they are pushing the national rate up, right? They are skewing the national rate. As readers, we could also try to pay attention to possible distortions in the data. There are plenty of examples in How Chat Slide. The simplest one, and also probably the funniest one, is this chart that appeared in Venezolana de Televisión, which is a TV channel in Venezuela, right after the 2013 presidential election in Venezuela. That was Nicolás Maduro against Enrique Capriles, the candidate from the opposition party. And Venezolana de Televisión presented this graph that you have over here, showing the percentage of vote of each one of the candidates. I have erased the numbers here temporarily just to show you what happened here. Because it seems, if you only take a look at the masses of color, it seems that Nicolás Maduro got, I don't know, 20 times the vote of Enrique Capriles, right? Just because the red bar is like 10 or 20 times the size of the blue bar. And in TV, these types of graphics usually appear only for a few seconds, not giving people enough time to pay attention to the graphic, which is completely essential to understand that chart. Now, what is the problem with this chart? That when you take a look at the numbers, you will notice that actually the difference was not that enormous. Whoever designed this chart exaggerated the differences between the two candidates by truncating the vertical axis. Now, truncating an axis is not bad in every single case. And in How Chat Slide, I present many examples of charts whose axes are truncated for good reason. Sometimes it is necessary to truncate axes to clarify a story. But when it comes to bar graphs, right, a bar graph is better that always starts at 0. Because if it doesn't start at 0, it ends up distorting the proportions between the numbers that are being represented in the chart. This type of trick is extremely common. Fuzzing with the axis of a chart, exaggerating differences or minimizing differences, collapsing the chart, making it narrower or wider or whatever, in order to make differences look smaller or bigger. And we need to be attentive to those types of tricks. And then, extremely important, there's a whole section about this in How Chat Slide, going back to full circle to what I said before about President Trump. One of the problems with reading charts is that it's extremely easy to project what we want to believe onto the charts that we see every day in news media or in social media. Now, this happens to all of us, all over the political spectrum. Don't think that you are smarter than anybody else. It happens to me. It happens to you. I have just proven to you that many of the problems that I highlighted in the talk today are problems that have happened to me. For instance, not paying enough attention to a chart and jumping to conclusions too quickly, right? It happens to all of us. So this is just an example. So a while ago, I witnessed a discussion in social media between different pundits, some of them in favor of the Affordable Care Act, namely Obamacare, some of them against the Affordable Care Act. As you all know, there's a whole discussion, years-long discussion as to whether the Affordable Care Act is a good idea or a bad idea. Personally, I think that is a good idea. I'm from Europe. We have quotation marks in there or scare quotations in there. In Europe, in Western Europe, we have socialized medicine, which is something that doesn't really scare me at all, right? It's sort of like a common sense idea from someone who comes from Europe. So I think that the Obamacare is a good idea because it's a step towards that in that direction. But in any case, I'm open to arguments against Obamacare. What I'm against, though, is against charts that are misused or that are overinterpreted. So I saw people on the left-hand side of the spectrum arguing that what conservatives usually say Obamacare, conservatives like to argue that Obamacare is not good for the job market, that Obamacare hinders the ability of companies to hire people. At least this was the argument several years ago. Maybe the argument has changed right now. And some leftists, liberal pundits were arguing, well, no, Obamacare is great for the job market, because if you take a look at the number of the people in the workforce, you will see that, well, there was a drop in people in the workforce, in private companies, due to the economic crisis, but then there was a recovery. And take a look at what happens very close to where the curve changes direction. The Affordable Care Act gets approved, and the curve continues increasing. So it's not true that Obamacare is bad for the job market. It's actually good for the job market, right? Because the curve increases quite a lot. Well, no, you cannot use this chart to argue that. Why? Because another key rule of data visualization, which is that a chart shows only what it shows and nothing else. Everything else that you see on a chart is something that is not in the chart. It's something that you're projecting onto the chart, that you are inferring from the chart. It happens in your brain. These people were arguing that just because there was a coincidence in time between the change of direction of the curve and the passing of Obamacare, one thing was causally connected to the other. And the chart doesn't really prove that. It only shows that there is a coincidence in time. But when we're reading a chart like this and listening to an argument like this, we should always think about possible alternative explanations to these, for example, to this change of direction. For instance, President Obama approved the stimulus package in February of 2009. So maybe, I'm not an economist, but this could be an alternative explanation, right? Maybe the billions of dollars that got injected in the private economy over here probably started having an effect over here, and that is what partially explains the change of direction of the curve. I'm not saying that this is true. I am only saying that it's a plausible alternative explanation to this change of direction of the curve. But not only that, when reading a chart like this and hearing an argument like this, we could also try to think about in terms of counterfactuals. What would have happened if the Affordable Care Act was killed in Congress or was killed in the Supreme Court, which was a realistic possibility at the time, right? What would the curve look like without Obamacare? Would it look like that? Because if it looked like that, it will mean that that conservatives are right, that Obamacare is bad for the job market. Because if Obamacare got killed, the curve will be much steeper, where the recovery will be much faster. Or would the curve look like that? Meaning that Obamacare is great for the job market because without Obamacare, the job market will recover at a much slower pace. Or would the curve look the same, meaning that there is no connection whatsoever between the Affordable Care Act and and companies hiring people? Which one of these is more realistic? We don't know. Why not? Because a chart is not enough. A chart shows only what it shows and nothing else. If we want to explore the possible causal links, causal connections between one phenomenon and another phenomenon, usually a single chart is not enough. Usually, very often, it's not enough. We need to go way beyond that chart in order to interpret that correctly. And then the final rule, which is that, and this is the conclusion of Outset's slide, how important it is to also try to act ethically as a good citizen. As a good citizen in an information republic, in an information environment. We are all responsible, I think, to improve the quality of the conversations that happen out there in social media, in civic spaces, etc. And charts are part of this conversation. Years ago, I read this book by my friend Jared Yates Sexton. I highly recommend this book, by the way. The People Are Going to Rise Like the Waters Upon Your Shore. It's probably one of my favorite titles ever. It's a chronicle. It's a story about what happened prior to the 2016 presidential election, and Jared tries to explain the reasons that the results of the election turned out as they did, right? But what captured my attention the most in this book is not the argument about demographics and culture and politics. There is a passage in the book in which he describes the information environment that we have here in the United States, and he says that as the networks, TV stations, and traditional news providers, newspapers, public radio, etc., have lost power throughout the years, the task of curating the news, of curating stories, of curating the information that we consume every day as readers, it has fallen to the social media, to people who are in social media. We are today gatekeepers of the information of that other people consume. In some sense, and this is something that I have argued in a previous book before Outset's slide, in some sense, we are all journalists today, because one of the traditional tasks of a journalist was to be the gatekeeper, the person who gathered information, processed information, and published that information. Today, we are all publishers. We are all responsible for the information that we put out there, that we promote out there. This is why it's so essential to pay attention to what we read, because if we don't pay attention to what we read, it will become much more likely that we will end up sharing information that we don't understand, or that we we have completely misunderstood, or that it could be false in many different cases. This doesn't mean, by the way, that social media platforms, for instance, Twitter or Facebook and others, don't have a responsibility. I believe that they do. But we also have a personal responsibility to improve the quality of the information that we put out there. And as I said before, charts are part of that information, because charts, when they are well designed and correctly understood and interpreted, they can lead us to better conversations, right? They can sort of like show the numbers and the patterns that hide behind the numbers. If we know how to read them well, they will help getting and having good conversations with other people. But if they are misinterpreted or if they are not correctly used, they can hinder those conversations. This is why it's so important to understand how charts work, and also how charts can lie or may lie, or how we lie to ourselves with them. Anyway, that's all that I have for you today. As I said before, well, I'm going to stop sharing. We have some time for questions. So I'm going to open the a questions window. Okay. So I'm seeing the first question here by Erica. What do you think that is the best way to convey some of the misleading complexities that you share? Should journalists use a new type of chart or use a caption to help readers correctly interpret the chart? That's an excellent question, and there are answers to that in the sort of hinted in the book. I am a great believer in explaining things. Right? Remember what I said before about the cone of uncertainty, right? By the National Hurricane Center. I said one of the problems with this chart is not the chart per se, is how the chart is presented. In many cases, what happens in TV stations when they talk about a hurricane approaching Florida is that they show that chart and then the presenter starts talking about something else without spending the time going over the chart, talking to people. Take a look at this cone. This cone is representing a set of possible paths of the center of the storm. And don't think that just because you are outside of the cone, you are out of danger, just because the cone only shows the center, the possible center of the storm, but the storms are enormous. That type of explanation helps people understand that particular graphic that you're showing, but it can also increase the graphicacy of the people who are watching your TV newscast. In this particular case, you are educating people in how to read not only that specific chart, but educating them in reading that group of charts, that type of chart that the National Hurricane Center puts out every hurricane season. The National Hurricane Center itself, by the way, they have published a very good video. I think that a couple of years ago, they published a video explaining how to read the cone and how to interpret the cone correctly. I felt that was great public service. Explanations are essential because, as I said before, a picture is not worth 1,000 words unless that you know how to read it. And in order to learn how to read a chart, you need to be taught how to read a chart. Remember what happens in elementary school, right? In elementary school, we are all taught how to read a histogram, or how to read a bar graph, or how to read a line chart. Those things are not naturally intuitive. Charts, as I explained in How Charts Lie, have a grammar. They have symbols and they have a grammar that dictates how those symbols are organized. In order to learn that grammar, we need to be taught that grammar in order to understand how to read it. In that sense, the design of charts, the design of visualizations is similar to writing. We need to learn the grammar in order to use the grammar, or in order to decode the grammar. How do you display the uncertainty in the data in the chart without making it too complicated? Another fantastic question. So if you're into, I guess that you work in data analysis or data science or statistics. If you're interested in that, I can share some resources that can answer that question. I don't know whether the organizers are online. Candace, if you're there, could you please enable the chat? Would that be possible? Because then I can share. Oh, perfect, great. So now it says say something nice. So yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm going to first share my slides. Let me see. I need to enable Dropbox. So I'm going to share a Dropbox link first, and that first Dropbox link is the PDF of the presentation that I have just shown. And now, Pat, I'm going to share, and this is a public folder that I have, in which I am collecting articles and papers and even some books about the visualization of uncertainty. And this folder contains several subfolders because it's a folder that I use to collect information for myself. There are many people who are doing research in this area. There are many techniques that can be used to show uncertainty and to display it. But the answer to your question is that it depends on the type of chart, because sometimes we design graphs, sometimes we design charts, sometimes we design maps, and every type of visualization may require a different display, a different way to display that uncertainty. So I would encourage you to go over some of the materials that you can find in that folder. I try to organize them in a way that they go from the most basic to the most advanced one. As a sophomore engineering, this is by Tom, this is from Tom. As a sophomore engineering student, I learned to always shown a broken vertical scale by a jagged axis line. I am surprised that this basic principle is not enforced in graphical software. Yeah, that's one of the techniques that I also try to encourage people to use. You can use a jagged line, you can use a white space, or you can use any other type of indication that the graphic has been truncated. Sometimes it is not necessary to add a jagged line if the labels that you put on the axis are big enough. So that depends a lot. I mean, in visualization, sometimes we learn, and this will probably be the topic of the next book that I will write after Houchet's Lie. Sometimes we learn rules that are not really rules, that are more recommendations. So adding a jagged axis line or a broken axis line or something like that, that's our recommendation. But there are many other alternative ways to show that an axis has been truncated. Another one is to increase the font size of the labels that you put on the axis, because then people will immediately see that the bottom line of your graph is not 0, is another number. And sometimes, actually quite often, you need a non-zero baseline. And there are many examples of graphics that do need a non-zero baseline in Houchet's Lie. I describe how to decide which axis, which scale to put on your graphics. Now, why is this basic principle not enforced in graphical software? Well, again, because it may not be a rule that is set in stone. There may be different ways to display these, to display the fact that an axis doesn't begin at 0, or that the axis has been truncated. There are different design techniques that can be used for that. Okay, so I see another question by Bryson. I see a lot of data visualization where things are off, whether it's underlying assumptions, veracity of underlying data, but the most common seems to be the comparisons on non-causal relationships. Somehow are hard to detect. Do you have any tips? Well, that could be another book on its own. There are many graphics that can be understood that way. Scatter plots are an example of that. Whenever you show the association between two variables, and there are some examples in Houchet's Lie, it is extremely easy for your brain to jump to conclusions, to just see the association between one variable and another variable, and say there's a causal connection between the two. Now, what is the technique to overcome that? There's not really an easy technique on the part of the designer. There is a technique on the part of the reader, which is to force yourself not to do that, to always keep repeating yourself. What I'm seeing is just an association. In some cases, those associations can be correlations, right? If an association is linear, it's a correlation, right? But correlation is not causation. So we need to force ourselves to do that. However, as I said before, I'm also a great believer in explanations. So I have come to believe that designers of charts, particularly charts that are being presented to the general public who don't necessarily have any formal training in statistics or in science, some sort of caption, some sort of explainer put in the chart itself, warning people this is just an association, is not causation, can really help people sort of like dismiss that automatic response that we have to that type of connection. This also happens, by the way, when you stack, for example, two line charts, and people see that the two lines co-vary in some way, it is extremely easy to jump to the conclusion that the two phenomena displayed in the two line graphs are somehow causally connected to each other. So some sort of warning that says these two things co-vary, they might be something here in terms of causation, but this doesn't necessarily imply causation. Saying that out loud, saying that explicitly, I think that it can help some people overcome that problem. the chart itself will not be able to break that connection, just because charts are so persuasive, right? That pattern of covariation in a line graph is so clear, so persuasive, so conspicuous that it automatically prompts your brain to see the causal connection between the two. But you can break the spell. We can break the spell. Mary Pat asked, is lack of numeracy, graphicus is something that you see is especially bad in the US, or do you see this universal? Spanish education is quite different from the US, so I'm curious. Yeah, I'm from Spain. I lived in Brazil for many years. I lived obviously in the US for many years. It's universal. It's not a problem with US education. It's a universal challenge. It's a universal challenge. Happens everywhere. I don't see significant differences between one country and the other. Then Alison, do you think animation can help provide some of the explanation necessary for interpretation? For example, on social media where there is no person to help explain, or sometimes the graph is separated from its context. Absolutely, you gave yourself the answer to the question. It could be, yeah, animation can be a great tool. I mean, I think taking advantage of the features of social media nowadays, the fact that you are not limited to publish static charts, that you can sort of like publish sequences of charts or of different graphical or textual elements, can really help with that. The more you can show, the more you can help people understand the graphic better. You should not go sort of like overboard with animation, like, because that can overload people. We should try to restrain ourselves in terms of the amount of information and detail that we show. But certainly animation can be one of the techniques that can be used. We should take advantage of it. I have never seen a graph where the axis should be truncated, except time. That doesn't really have a start. Either the changes are big enough to be important or correctly fall away by the wayside when not truncated. Well, there are many other cases. So there are other cases. So for instance, when you show changes in overall temperature in the world, right? Climate scientists, for instance, I have many friends who work here at the university who work in environmental science and in climate science. They do need to truncate their line graphs, just because the changes, very tiny changes in overall global temperature, changes that look very tiny, of just 0.5 degrees, right, may be extremely significant. Therefore, it is important, if you plot those changes in a line graph, to try to exaggerate the axis a little bit in order to see those changes clearly. Because if you use a non-truncated axis, the line may end up looking flat. You will not be able to see those differences. And a difference of like 0.3, 0.5 degrees over a decade, it sounds like a very small change, but it's actually a very significant change, a very important change. So there's not really a rule as to when to truncate or not truncate, exaggerate, not to exaggerate, exaggerate the axis of a chart. As I said before, I don't see the design of charts as much as sort of like geometry or engineering in some sense. I see it more similarly to how I see writing. That there are certain principles, certain rules that we need to follow, but those principles and rules depend a lot on the context, depend a lot on the nature of the data that is being represented, depends a lot on the purposes of the chart that you are designing, depends a lot on the patterns and trends that you want people to perceive in the data for some reason. And one of those decisions is how to set up the axis of your chart. So there's not a universal rule. It depends a lot on those elements that sort of like create the context of the chart. Mary Pat asks again another question: what visualization tools do you use most and why? I use a huge variety, and I always hesitate to sort of like mention the tools that I use, because I feel that it may look like I am trying to promote them over others, and that is not the case. I use plenty of design tools because I'm still a journalist and a designer at heart. So I still use a design tool called Adobe Illustrator to design particularly illustrations, but also to polish my graphics. I use the R programming language. R, the letter R. It's a program, an open source, free a programming language for statistical analysis and statistical display. So I use R, but then I use a huge variety of tools. I use anything from a tool called Data Wrapper, which lets you create interactive data visualizations. Data Wrapper as in wrapping something up, right? Wrapping the data up, Data Wrapper. I use another one called Flourish. I use another one called Insight with a Z because it was designed in New Zealand, therefore Insight. I also use, I use row graphs. There's another one called Data Illustrator. All these tools are free or freemium. So I use a huge variety. I use tools for mapping, but there are many others. So the universe of tools these days is so enormous. So sometimes, for instance, when I say I use the R programming language, some people who are coders or programmers or data analysts say, and why don't you use Python, which is another programming language that also has data analysis and visualization capabilities? Is it because you like R better? And I say, no, it's just because I just learned R and R gets the job done. So for the sort of like very basic operations that I need to undertake, I can just get them done with R. R is powerful enough. So, and I'm also quite lazy. So why should I use another tool if I don't need to? So I only incorporate a new tool into my toolkit whenever I have the need for those tools. Karen just put in the chat window, I have been a huge fan of yours for many years. I really appreciate that. Really, really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Anyway, it seems that all the questions have been answered. It's 10:05 down here in Miami. I'm seeing Candace again there.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on and thank you so much for presenting tonight. It was taking me back to a statistics course that I took in college, and I think maybe if I had taken it with you, I might have gotten a better grade.
It will be more fun, and there will be more F-bombs in the course, although I don't usually drop F-bombs in talks or in classes, but certainly I do in the book.
Fun. Yeah, that's great. And thank you so much for being so generous with your resources. I just wanted to mention to everyone in the audience, if you need to come back to this link, this event page will live on. So know that'll stay there if you need to come back and reference that. And thank you all so much for watching tonight. I want to encourage you to purchase a copy of Alberto's book from Elliott Bay. You can do that by clicking the Buy the Book button right here, or there's a link in the YouTube chat that's going to take you right over to Elliott Bay's website. And if you want to follow more Town Hall content, you can follow this Crowdcast channel by clicking the follow button in the top right-hand corner. But thank you so much again, Professor Cairo. This has been really fun, very fascinating.
Thank you.
So thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you again sometime.
Really appreciate it. Take care. Take care.